Evening everybody, welcome to EXA X4. You join us here in this nice and hot Qatar for the sprint qualifying, sprint race, normal qualifying and the feature race. Of course we have got 15 drivers on the grid, so we'll get to see who is going to be the fastest and be on pole for the sprint race. Right, we're up to 16 now. And there's the first driver going out of the pits, is an Aston Martin. Of course, a couple of drivers just thinking the exact same thing, following in suit. Yeah, of course, a nice tight and twisty track. You've got your fair share of corners, of course. This track does have 16 corners, one DRS zone, and the detection zone is just before the last corner. We're just waiting on some of the drivers coming round to start their first flying lap. So as we wait and see Mark almost at the last corner to start his first flying lap. I think he's going to have 2 cars of traffic as he crosses the line and starts the first qualifying lap of the evening. So we see him go through turn 1. Looking to keep it inside those white lines so he doesn't get an invalidated lap. Of course, it looks like he's got a kick Sauber up, just up in front there. I think he's going to catch him just at the nasty part of the track, turns 7, 8, 9 and 10. See, he comes across the line to go into sector 3. So I don't think he's actually going to catch the kick Sauber. Of course, he will be going on to a flying lap. Mark with a 123.5. Let's see who else is out on a flying lap. We've got the other Aston Martin. We've got Mystic Rick. He is out on his first flying lap of the evening. As Dion putting in a 122.8 there, take provisional pole. Of course, only 2 fast laps being done so far. 3 now that Frost Breath has put in a 122.8, just too slow there for him there. Of course, he was wanting to try and get that first place, get a better start to the sprint race. Where's Mystic Rick? He has invalidated his lap. I think Sim was 5. He is on his first flying lap of the evening. He comes round the last corner. He's got to cross the line. He puts himself on provisional pole right now. Provisional pole for the Red Bull of Sin Wars there. Really nice tidy lap. Of course, some people out on the mediums and some people out on the softs. Of course, EXA Coonboy, he is on his first flying lap of the evening. Of course, that Mercedes looking to get up there beside his teammate Dion. So he just crosses the line to come up and into sector 3. Of course, those 3 right-handers. Of course, really long corner. Let's see as he comes in the last corner. He's on his way up to the line. And he crosses the line to go 8th with a 1:23.4. Not his best lap, but I think he'll be looking to do better than that for the next lap if he has enough time. So got Ultra just put himself up there in 4th, tied with 3rd place there. Oh, and Phelan, he's just invalidated his lap. So we've got Liam, of course, he's on the medium tyre. Actually, I think having the Quicksilver, he'll be looking to maybe push it up near his teammate into the top 5 or 6. As Dion goes fastest with a 1:22.4, just 4/10ths faster than Simwars there. So Liam coming through turn 10 on the run up to turn 11. Of course, just going into sector 3. And he's purple in the second sector. Could this be your next provisional pole? We just have to wait and see. We've only got one more corner to go. And he does, he puts it on provisional pole with a 1:22.423. Just almost a 10th ahead of Dion there in second. Because I think this is Danger Winstone second flying lap. Missed that lap, but he does go 1/10 faster, because that does put him right beside his teammate of Crazy. So where Liam just finished his flying lap. Of course, round PK, of course, he has not done a flying lap so far for this qualifying. Of course, the only flying lap they'll get is now. Of course, only 3 minutes remaining. This is where you'll see quite a few of the drivers coming out of the pits, just trying to make their position any higher than they can. And of course, as the timing screens are right, he is going purple in sector 1. This is setting up to be a quick flying lap if he just keeps his cool and makes it around the track. Of course, Mark, that's him done with his qualifying. I don't think he'll be able to go any faster. Yeah, as Liam's saying, he doesn't think he'll have time to get back round the rest of the track in time. Cause Realm just going fastest there. 122.240. Cause that was a nice lap there by Realm. Cause a lot of the people on their out laps right now just waiting as Liam of course going to try and beat the clock here is 1 minute and 40 seconds. This is going to be a race round the track for Liam here. He's got 1 minute and 30 seconds to put the foot down and get round the track to start his flying lap. He is racing against time here. Of course, Crazy PP, he is on a flying lap. Of course, Liam is just 2 cars behind them there. Okay, of course, as we're coming up to the end of qualifying. Liam is going to be cutting it close. See Crazy coming around the second last corner on the run up to the last corner. It does look like that Liam's going to make it. And he does put it on provisional pole. Crazy with a 122.1. And Liam just scrapes it to the line to start his last sprint qualifying lap. Of course, the McLaren just not getting out of the way there. Of course, this is his last chance. He managed to make it round to the start finish straight in 1 minute and 40 seconds. Rictic Ada in the kicks out with a 121.7. Over 4/10 faster than second place. Never mind. Second place has now got a 122.1. Frost Rob is 121.8. All the times are just getting so close now as we're on the cusp of the end of sprint qualifying, of course. And there goes Phelan with a 121.3, taking provisional pole so far. Only a few cars left to cross the line, of course. One of them being Liam, who only just made it round to the start-finish straight. We see Liam coming round the last corner. I'm about to see where he puts it. Second place, 121.6, just in front of his teammate. So of course that is everyone's qualifying lap. Of course finished now. Yeah, of course that was definitely a half decent qualifying for most people anyway. Of course, first is Phelan, then you've got Liam, of course, getting blocked by the McLaren right at the start of his flying lap. We've got Rictic Ada in third, Rob in fourth, Hans fifth, Dion sixth, Ultra in seventh, Coomboy in eighth, Crazy PP in nine. And to round off your top 10, we've got Seven. Then we've got Realm, Meeks, Simwars 5, Danger Winstone, Mark Armstrong, Mystic Rick, Fleming. And that is your grid for the sprint race. Of course, some people using a mix-up of tyres. of course, the mediums and the softs in sprint qualifying, so it'll be a nice scene to see what tyres everyone is going to use for the main sprint race. Of course, extra points for all the drivers are up for grabs here. Of course, that looks like it's going to be a very hot race, of course, during the day, just almost edging into that night time. As we wait and see on all the drivers choosing what tyres are going to be used, and of course they have to be aware, of course, they need some tyres for the race as well. And it's 5 red lights. And we are go! Let's see, of course, Fleming in first, getting off to a nice start there. Of course, it's all about the first corner. Of course, one of the kick servers are just going a little bit wide there. Of course, at least everyone made it through the first corner, at least that's all you can think of it, at least everyone made it through the first corner. Of course, Phelan looking to make that gap. Oh, and what's happened? Mark is off. And it looks like the front right of his wing is away with him as well. That is not the start that he needed. Oh, and Meeks, he's had an accident. Of course, he is off as well. He's down where Mark is. Because everyone else still getting away good here. Of course, Liam looking to make that overtake. Of course, only 10 laps of the sprint race. If you go further down the field, you've got Ultra battling for 5th. And there's Rictic Aiden already with a 3-second time penalty. First penalty of the weekend. Of course, we've got the 2 Ferraris, 9th and 10th. Of course, Realm looking to get past one of them. It doesn't look like he's got to do it yet. Of course, DRS will be activated now. Of course, a kick sour, nice overtake on the McLaren. Of course, I think he's just trying to get revenge on McLaren for what happened there in qualifying when he was about to start his qualifying. Of course, with the McLaren not moving out of the way, and Mark Armstrong has been given a 10-second penalty for speeding in the pit lane. Of course, Liam and Failing almost breaking that 1 second to Hans. Of course, only one DRS zone, and that is just after turn 15 on the run down to the last corner before the long DRS straight going along the start finish straight. Of course, further down the field, of course, Ultra, he's got past Rob Coomboy. He'll be looking to make his way up into 7th. Some nice extra points there. Of course, 2 Ferraris still in 9th and 10th. You've got Realm in 11th with the Mercedes on his rear wing. Of course, then you've got Mystic Rick, Fleming, Simwers 5, and of course, the 2 people who have had the accidents. Of course, Meeks and Armstrong. We're coming up into the first corner. Phelan looking to get past Liam. Liam just looking round the outside. He's going to have the inside line for turn 2. And he is going to keep first place. He was smart there, of course, making sure, trying to make sure that Phelan cannot get past. Phelan looking for the inside. Pushes Liam wide there. Of course, Hans going a little bit wide there as well. Of course, Hans looking for the inside on the McLaren of Phelan. Of course, he does make that move happen, moves up into 2nd place. Of course, now Liam's got to watch. He's got an angry RB of Hans on his rear wing, looking to make his way up into 1st place, take the maximum points for the sprint race. Of course, Liam doing really well here, just managing to to keep his cool and stay in first place. Of course, now we'll check what tyres everyone is on. Everyone has decided to go on the mediums, of course. 10 laps to stop wouldn't last, of course. Hard tyres are probably not the way to go here with this race anyway. Of course, being so hot, and the tyres will probably just degrade a lot faster. Of course, failing. Is he going to get it done? He's trying to go down the inside of Hans. Of course, Hans has got the inside line, of course. Failing, just trying to get it there. Of course, Liam just falling down into second. Of course, Hans, and then you've got the Kick Sauber's teammate, of course, Ritik Aiden, with that 3-second time penalty, of course. Oh, just almost contact there. As Hans is still looking for that move. Is Hans eventually going to get it? He's going to have the inside line. Because this is just like failing, just pull away, eh? Getting almost out of that DRS there. Yeah, failing, just almost got away from Liam there, but Liam's just saying, no, I'm staying with you. Of course, Liam qualifying second for the sprint race, staying in second for the time being. Yeah, of course, failing, and Liam just making a gap from third place. Of course, now the Haas. As we've got a yellow flag here. I think that was for either the RB or it was for the Red Bull. Well, definitely been a very interesting race so far here in Qatar. Of course, now they're 2 seconds ahead of third place. Really nice driving here from first and second place as Fleming picks up a 3-second time penalty. Yeah, of course, battle for fourth. We've got, of course, Rob, Aiden, everyone from third place all the way down to 12th. Of course, all on one DRS train here. Of course, definitely positions changing hands. As look at that, we see the Ferrari just trying to overtake the Kick Sauber of Rick. To move down into 7th place, of course. Saven looking to get past Crazy, of course. Oh, there's Realm and Dion both picking up a 3-second time penalty there. Multiple warnings. Of course, that's 6 people with time penalties. In the sprint race, of course, we're on lap 7. So we've only got 4 laps to go. Of course, Hans now caught back up those 2 seconds, back up behind Liam where he wants to be. Yeah, of course, Rob looking to get on the podium for the sprint race. Of course, all he has to do is overtake Hans, which is definitely easier said than done. Of course, back down the field we've got Mystic Rick looking to get past Danger Windstone. Of course, get up into 9th place. Of course, still got the battle going on. Of course, Phelan holding his ground in 1st place. Of course, Liam behind him with Hans as well. As Rictic Aiden comes into the pits. I don't know what that's for. I think he has just retired. Yes, he has. He has retired. Oh, of course, Hans now dropped back down into 4th. Of course, 2.8 seconds ahead of 5th place. Of course, that is crazy in the Ferrari. Of course, so now our front 3 is Phelan, Liam and Rob. Of course, a few drivers are making up positions here. Of course, Mystic Rick having a nice sprint race. Of course, made up 7 places, same as Danger Windstone. Of course, Fleming, Savant and Crazy have also made up 4 positions. Of course, Ultra not having the best sprint race. Of course, down 8 positions, but Liam's just pulled himself back up and into 1st place. Of course, now we've got a battle for 1st. Of course, there's Liam, Phelan, Rob and Hans all fighting just for those podium positions. Yeah, so look at it just a little bit further back down the field. Of course, battle for 5th. Of course, you've got Crazy, Dion, Realm, Mystic, Rick, Coomboy and Savan. Of course, all in that DRS train. Of course, we're about to go on to the final lap of the sprint race. Of course, even further down the field, of course. In 14th, we've got Fleming catching up to the back of Meeks. Of course, and leading us through onto the final lap is going to be Liam. Of course, Ultra just having a crash there at the back, of course, down to 15th. Oh, it's Phelan goes round the first corner. Of course, Liam will be looking to get past, of course, no DRS except that start finish straight. Of course, let's see as Liam trying to take back that 1st place. He does get that 1st place. Of course, Rob getting up into 3rd place and Hans just having to quickly tweak his car there. Of course, just running a little bit wide. And Hans has just got a 3-second penalty. It will still keep him in 4th. As Crazy is over 4 seconds behind. As you see, we're coming up to the end of the sprint race. Of course, the last few corners here. Of course, on the run up to turn 15. This is Phelan's last chance. We've got a McLaren off the track there, way down in 14th. as Liam comes across the line in first place and your sprint race winner. Of course, Phelan following him in second, with Rob in third, Hans in fourth, Crazy in sixth, Danger Windstone, Coomboy in seventh, Saven in eighth, Realm in ninth, Dion in 10th, Mystic Rick in 11th, Simwars 5 in 12th, Meeks in 13th, and of course we're just waiting on the other few coming back across the line. Of course, Flem in 14th, Ultra of course coming round to cross the line in 15th, and Mark in 16th. Of course, very interesting sprint race. Of course, that is the position changes for you. Of course, Danger Windstone and Mystic Rick, of course, making up lots of positions there. Of course, Danger with 8 positions made up. He is the highest person to make up positions in the sprint race. Now is the time to quickly get a drink before qualifying starts. Of course, Danger Windstone does get driver of the day for the sprint race, so well done to him. Right, we are back. Of course, night time now. Qualifying. Of course, for the feature race. We've already got one of the kick saubers going out. Of course, Victic Aiden, first driver to go out. Of course, drivers do have longer this time. They've got 18 minutes to get their perfect lap. You see Rectic Aiden just getting round the track, going to do his first qualifying lap. Of course, we've got Mystic Rick and Rob, of course, coming out of the pits. They're also on the out lap with Saven. Of course, Rectic Aiden's teammate, of course, in the other kick sauber. Of course, Liam, he qualified second with Phelan just in first, but he did finish first place in that sprint race. Of course, he'll be looking to do the exact same for the feature race. Of course, Rectic Aiden looking like he's going to have a clean track for his first qualifying lap. Of course, the grip will be lower. Of course, it is at night time, it is colder. Tires take a little bit longer to heat up than they usually would. Of course, Rectic Aiden coming up towards turns 4 and 5. Because a few other people, of course, just starting their flying lap. Of course, this will be a nice sight to see. Get to see who's gonna come out on top in qualifying. I couldn't speak there. Hectic Aiden coming up towards turn 15. So he comes round the last corner. Of course, the first person to cross the line in this qualifying session. He puts in a 1:22.2, about 7 tenths behind the fastest driver of sprint qualifying. Yep, there's a few drivers just putting in slightly faster laps there. Of course, we've got Hans, he's on a flying lap. Here we'll get to see where the RB of Hans puts it. Of course, almost finishing on the podium. Of course, had a nice battle with first and second in the sprint race. Of course, he has just invalidated his lap. Of course, crazy, he is on a flying lap as well. Of course, as I said earlier, and of course, drivers do have more time to do their flying laps. Of course, they're not rushed into an 8-minute period, so it's like literally just trying to squeeze in 2 laps. Of course, because if you need to tweak your setup, of course, you have to do it before your first run in qualifying. There's Crazy PP just coming up to the last corner. Let's see, is he going to try and get pole position so far? He puts himself in 6th, of course, probably not his fastest time, but I think he'll be doing another lap. Because that looks like Meeks, yeah, he has just started his first flying lap. Just coming up towards turns 2 and 3. Of course, this track being such a tight and twisty track, because you've got a lot of people that run wide at some of the corners. Of course, it's really annoying when that person running wide is you. Of course, Meek's just not looking to run wide. Probably doesn't have that mindset. He has that mindset of try and be the fastest driver, the cleanest driver, and overall the best driver. Because there goes Dion with his first lap, and it is his fastest lap. Of course, provisional polls so far. Of course, 8 drivers done flying laps. Of course, Meeks now makes it 9. So Meeks going 7th with a 1:22.9. Looks like Ultra, he is on a flying lap. Of course, he's in the Red Bull, of course, with his teammate Sinwars. I think Ultra is doing 2 warm-up laps. I have no idea. See, of course, now he's started his first flying lap. Of course, got an extra warm-up lap, and just before he started his first flying lap. Of course, maybe getting that extra heat into his tyres. Yeah, of course, 10 minutes down in this session. Of course, only 8 minutes and 40 seconds to go. Of course, the grip is high now. I just see Ultra just coming round turn 15 on the run up to the final corner. Where is Ultra going to place that Red Bull? And it is in 5th place with a 1:22.2. Of course, Rob just beaten Ultra there for that 5th place. Of course, you could say that that he did rob Ultra there of that 5th place. Of course, not that much faster. Of course, not even a 10th faster there. Of course, let's see who else is on their first flying laps. So of course we've got Simwars 5. Of course, his teammate did just put in a 1:22.2. Mystic Rick goes fastest. Simwars coming up towards turns 12, 13 and 14. Of course, all right-handers. Oh, and he's just invalidated his lap there. Of course, he'll definitely be looking to get back in the pits and get another lap ready for him. Of course, not what he wanted there. Of course, with failing, he's on a flying lap. Of course, he's got an Aston Martin in front of him. He is going purple in sector 1. Of course, we have still got to see where Liam's going to go. Of course, he was first place in the sprint qualified. Of course, failing was your pole sitter for the sprint race. Of course, he'll just be looking to do the exact same thing again. Get pole, and hopefully I think he'll be looking this time just to finish first. It looks like Phelan is using the Aston Martin for a tow there. Of course, this might make his lap a little bit faster. Oh, or not there. He puts on a 1:22.1. Of course, only 6th place, so he'll be getting back round to the pits and getting his tyres sorted. Of course, Liam just saying there that he's doing 1 lap at the end. Of course, that 1 lap has to be absolutely spot on. because I think that's what most of the drivers are doing here, just waiting for that one lap. Because most people are all in the pits right now. Of course, it looks like Realm, I think he's on an in lap. Or maybe this is just a tactic to get out in front of everyone. That looks like that's what his teammates done of Seven. Or I think he might be on a flying lap. Of course, we'll get to see them now if they are on out laps. Of course, it does look like Realm. I think he is about to go for a flying lap. And he switches his ERS onto overtake, and of course then it'll go over to hot lap. Of course, I think that's what his teammate of Seven is going to do as well. I think he's just about to come across and start his final flying lap. Of course, both the Williams playing it smart there. Of course, getting out before everyone else decides to come out. Of course, both the Ferraris, one right behind the other, of course, coming out of the pits. Of course, they'll definitely want to create a little bit of a gap. Of course, Danger just backing off a little bit, giving his teammates some breathing room. Of course, don't want to be right up behind there. Of course, Liam just retiring for the session there. Of course, both the Williams, of course, they're on their flying laps. Of course, Realm, he's invalidated his lap. I think he'll be looking to quickly jump into the pits. New tyres, quickly back out. Of course, if Liam can make it in 1 minute and 40 seconds, I think he can too. Of course, Seven, he's on his final flying lap. The question is, does he think he's going faster? I think he is going faster. And he just bails on that lap. I think he's just decided to come into the pits. I don't know if he'll have enough time to get back out. Of course, Realm just getting his car back into the pits, and I think he'll be sending it right back out again. Of course, we've got both the Ferraris on their flying laps, of course, managed to make that gap, of course, between each other for the flying laps. Of course, there's Realm coming back out. He's only got 1 minute to get round, though. I don't think that's going to happen. If he gets round within 1 minute, which I don't think is going to happen, because, of course, Liam only had about 20 seconds to spare when he got round. Because he's now only got 30 seconds. Of course, it is a 1 minute 20 a lap, so he's definitely not getting round in time, I don't think. Yeah, he's not getting round there in 9 seconds. Of course, Ultra on his last flying lap. Of course, he is in the Red Bull. Oh, and he has invalidated his lap. Because that is not what he wanted. Because we've got Kumboy on. Everyone is on their last flying laps. Because this is where the grid can get shaken up. Who is going to be your pole sitter? Of course, Crazy PP, he is invalidated. So is Danger Windstone. So I think that's it. I think it is Mystic Rick. It is Mystic Rick is your pole sitter, of course. Aston Martin. Of course, Phelan in second, Dion third, Aiden fourth, Robin fifth, Crazy in sixth, Kumboy seventh. Then you've got Danger, Realm, Ultra, Meeks, Seven, Mark, Hans, and of course Sin Wars, Liam, and Fleming. Of course, Realm just a little bit too slow there, just trying to get back out of the pits, of course, as fast as possible. Of course, this will be definitely an action-packed race, of course. Mystic Rick just managing to qualify ahead of the previous pole sitter, of course, from the sprint race, of course, failing, just not managing to get his lap fast enough that he could go faster than Mystic Rick. Of course, as we're just waiting on all the drivers picking their setups, of course, this is the moment that we have been waiting for, of course, the feature race, the main race. And it's 5 red lights. And away we go. Of course, Mystic Rick in first place, getting off to a decent start there. Of course, is he going to be able to retain that first place going into the first corner? Of course, failing on his rear wing there. Of course, most drivers starting on the medium tyres. Of course, only 3 drivers starting on the hards. And we've got a car off, and that is Ultra. He has just put himself into the wall there. Because Rectic just retiring from the session. I don't know what happened to him there. Of course, Mystic Rick still holding his lead in first place. Of course, we've already got quite a few position changes. Of course, Liam already making up 9 positions just in the first lap. Of course, he did start 16th. Of course, failing in that McLaren, just looking to keep his first place. Of course, used a lot of his ERS already. And there's your possible race strategies on the screen. Of course, none of those strategies, of course, involve the soft tyres. Of course, I think they'll just wear out too much on this track. Of course, Meeks 3.3 seconds behind his teammate of Hans. Oh, and there's Danger Winston getting the first penalty of this race. Of course, we'll go back up to the front of the grid. We've got Mystic Rick in first with Phelan, and then we've got Dion, of course, in third place. Oh, Liam making his way up into fourth place. Of course, he is almost on that podium already. Of course, he did start way down in 16th. So as we see Mystic Rick just getting pushed off the track there, but still managing to keep first place. Mark picking up that 3-second time penalty. I was failing with that DRS, just getting past Mystic Rick there. Of course, Liam still managing to hold it in fourth. Coomboy getting past Rob there as well. Of course, Liam looking to get past Dion. Of course, then they've got Crazy on the back of that, just looking to try and make his way up into the podium. Of course, Dion is looking to get past Mystic Rick there. Of course, looking to take that second place off of the Aston Martin. As Mystic Rick picks up a 3-second time penalty. And Liam does make his way up into third place. Of course, Dion just dropped down into fifth place. Phelan just pulling away from Mystic Rick, getting out of that DRS. Of course, Mystic Rick will not have the DRS for that long straight, I don't think. Does Mystic Rick have DRS? No, he does not. He does not have the DRS. Because he heads back in to that 1 second, of course. Of course, Liam, he's back up and he's on the podium. Of course, he wants to try and finish first like he did in that sprint race. Of course, well fought victory for him though in the sprint race. Of course, as we look further down the field, we've got Dion in 5th, of course, 1.5 seconds ahead of Rob as Savan picks up a 3-second time penalty. Of course, then we've got Meeks, and then of course his teammate up in 7th, which is Hans, and then we've got, and of course he's looking to battle up there for a podium position. Of course, he was close to getting one last time in the sprint race. Is Mark picking up a 3-second time penalty there? Of course, Realm looking to get past Meeks there as Hans puts himself up into 6th place. Rob dropping down into 8th. And Danger just getting past Rob there as well. Of course, Phelan just trying to break that 1 second on Phelan. Of course, he has done that for now. Of course, right, is almost back into it. Of course, not even. He's only just over 1 second. Of course, he keeps going back in and then back out of that DRS. Of course, Liam, he is going to have DRS. Of course, he'll be liking it if Mystic Rick does not get the DRS. Which I don't think he does, as Danger Winstone picks up another 3-second time penalty. We're about to find out if Mystic Rick does have DRS, and he does not. Of course, that's going to put Liam up into 2nd place. Of course, he does have that DRS. Of course, now Liam, he'll be right on the back of Phelan. He wants to get 1st place. Of course, if we look further down the field, of course, we've got Savan and Realm. Of course, both teammates in 11th and 12th. Of course, Sinmore's looking to get past both Williams drivers. Of course, then we've got Meeks and the Haas. Of course, Danger Winstone looking to get past Hans. Of course, doesn't help that Danger does have that 3-second time penalty, which will more than likely get served when he does come in to the pits to make his first pit stop, maybe his only pit stop of the race. As Crazy picks up a 3-second time penalty. Of course, he's in 4th. Of course, now him and Mystic Rick both have 3-second time penalties for the race that'll probably get taken off in the pit lane. Of course, they'll need to for that reason. Of course, when they come in for the pit stop, because Liam, of course, now making it back up and into 1st place. Of course, he did start last. Of course, Liam and Phelan, of course, they both did fight for 1st place last time, of course, but Liam just came out on top on that one. Because as we take a look down near the back of the field, As we see, we've got the Red Bull, and then we've got 3 blue cars, of course, Seven, Meeks and Realm. Of course, the Red Bull, of course, he's on the medium tyre. Of course, there was only 3 people that started on the hard tyre. And then just up from that, we've got, of course, Danger Windstone, of course, that 3-second time penalty. Of course, he has got Coomboy just in front of him. Of course, Coomboy's got hands, and then there's Frost Rob, which is 4.3 seconds behind Mercedes of Dion. Of course, Dion is in 5th place. And then we've got Crazy in 4th, and Mystic Rick, of course, both have that 3-second time penalty. Of course, disadvantage, of course. Of course, as we see, Liam and Phelan, of course, still fighting for that 1st place, and as Hans gets handed a 3-second time penalty. Of course, as we see Phelan, of course, he is wanting to finish first. Of course, didn't last time. Of course, he did finish 2nd. Of course, Liam did finish in that 1st place. Of course, well fought victory, of course, in that sprint. Of course, we've got Dion, he's sitting in 5th with 2 people with 3-second time penalties behind him there. So of course they have pulled out that 1 second on Mystic Rick. So we're about to see if Crazy or Dion will get past one another. Of course, there's Liam and Mystic Rick into the pits. I don't know if they're going for the 2-stop strategy, or if that's them coming in and putting on hards for the next 19 laps. Of course, that does bump Crazy and Dion up into 2nd and 3rd place. Of course, Crazy just looking to get back past Dion. But Dion has the inside line. He's going to keep that 2nd place so far. Of course, Phelan now 2.4 seconds ahead of 2nd place. As we quickly check what tyres Liam and Mystic Rick have went on. They've gone on the hards. I think that'll be them until the end of this race. Of course, Crazy just looking to get back past Dion, of course, before the pit stops. Of course, some of the medium runners will be looking to extend their mediums until probably around about lap 11 or 12 to come in for the hard tyres. Of course, they will have better hard tyres. Of course, Liam and Mystic Rick will be looking to catch up as much as they can. Of course, trying that undercut strategy there on everyone else. Of course, they'll be hoping that it works. Of course, if it doesn't, there's really nothing that you can do. Has Mark been handed another 3-second time penalty? Of course, Coomboy and Hans having a nice battle there. Who's going to get the better of who? Of course, Danger Windstone just having to sit there in 6th place. Of course, watch this fight happen while he gets blocked. Of course, when the other driver goes for a move, of course the Ferrari cannot do anything about it. Of course, Phelan, I think he's just came into the pits. Of course, he has put on the hard tyres, and he did come out just in front of Liam there. Of course, this has definitely been an interesting race. Of course, you've got Crazy and Dion, of course, fighting for that 1st place. Because this has definitely been an interesting race anyway. Because Crazy also has that penalty which definitely does not help him in any way. Of course, Liam, Phelan and Mr. Rick, they're all back up into 10th, 11th and 12th place, of course. Of course, only 3 or 4 drivers making that pit stop. Of course, in comes Crazy into the pits. I think that'll give Dion some relief until he comes into the pits, of course. He's 3.2 seconds behind Rob. Of course, there's both the Ferraris coming into the pits. Of course, but no one getting held up there. Of course, Simwars, he's into the pits. And I think that's the hard tyre. Of course, I think that's what everyone's going. I think everyone's just doing a one-stop strategy there. As we have a look, yep, everyone that's came into the pits, they have put on those hard compound of tyres. Of course, the top 5 has not come into the pits yet. Now, it doesn't look like the people who have came into the pits served their penalty. Of course, Realm just picking up that 3-second time penalty. Of course, as there's Realm, Coomboy, Hans and Dion, of course, all into the pits. Of course, this is where everyone starting to make that mandatory pit stop, of course, off of the mediums. Of course, the only person now on the mediums, of course, is Fleming. Of course, Mark, he's going to have to swap onto the mediums, the same as Realm and Rob. Of course, they did start on those hard compound of tyres. Of course, they want to finish on the faster tyre. Of course, Rob in first place so far in this race. Of course, hasn't came into the pits yet. Of course, Liam, Mystic, Rick, of course, they've both fought their way back up to 4th and 5th. Of course, Phelan, I was just about to say, nice getting back up there into 3rd place. And just as I was about to say that, he does pick up that 3-second time penalty. Liam behind him will be hoping that he could stay within that 3 seconds and hopefully overtake him at some point. Or even if he doesn't overtake him, as long as he's within 3 seconds, he will get past him after the race. Of course, Frost, Rob and Realm, of course, both haven't came into the pits. Of course, there's Liam getting back past him there. Yeah, so the people to still make pit stops, of course, 1st and 2nd, of course, Rob and Realm. Of course, Mark still got to make that pit stop, and so is Fleming. Of course, a lot of people with penalties so far in this race. Of course, Liam making up 13 positions. Of course, he did start last, of course, in this race. Of course, it'll be weird to see when Fleming comes into the pits. Of course, he's on 13 lap old mediums. Of course, when first and second do come into the pits, of course, at least down to third, fifth place, I'll get up and into above Realm and Rob. Of course, as Rob comes into the pits. Of course, this will be good to see. Of course, I think that was the other McLaren coming into the pits. Where is Rob going to come out? Is Liam getting handed a 3-second time penalty? Of course, that is technically your provisional front three. Of course, failing Liam and Mystic Rick. Of course, Crazy as well. Of course, second, third, fourth and fifth so far. Of course, we are 3-second penalty. Of course, Realm has still got to come into the pits. Of course, this is definitely been an entertaining race. Of course, Realm still got to come into the pits. The longer that he leaves it, the further back that he's more than likely going to be. Of course, he wants to be the fast driver, of course, near the end of the race. Of course, one of three going on to the mediums at the end of the race. Of course, as there's Realm coming into the pits, of course, he'll be putting on those medium set of tyres. Of course, that does put Liam, Phelan and Mystic Rick back up into the top three. Of course, Dion and Crazy, of course, they're fourth and fifth fighting. Of course, Dion's 7.5 seconds behind, of course, those podium positions. Of course, further back, of course, battle for 9th, of course, battle for 8th, we've got Danger, of course, looking to get past Realm. Of course, he's just came out of the pits on his brand new tyres. Of course, he did start on the hard as Silver's 5 picks up a 3-second time penalty. Of course, Realm did start on the hard tyre, because now he is on the brand new medium tyre. Of course, Rob, he's in 6th place. He's only just on the brand new medium tyre, of course. Only got 10, 11 laps to go. Of course, as Dion takes his fastest lap, of course, everyone just trying to get that fastest lap. Of course, Hans is your current fastest lap holder. We'll go back up to see what the front three are up to. Of course, still failing in first. Of course, Liam following suit in second. Of course, all three of them doing the undercut near the start of this race. Yeah, those three did do the undercut. Of course, it has worked. Of course, almost 8 seconds ahead of 4th place. Of course, so the undercut seems to have worked so far. Of course, Meeks gets another 3-second time penalty. course, there's Liam getting past Phelan up into first place. Of course, he'll be looking to keep that first place now that he's got past Phelan. Of course, doesn't help with the DRS zone. Of course, there's only 4 drivers that have not got penalties so far. Of course, every other driver on the grid has got penalties. Of course, the front 3 have got 3-second time penalties. Of course, if it stays like this, of course, Crazy will get dropped down into 7th place. Of course, not what he wants. Of course, these were your first 2 in the last race. Of course, Liam and Phelan, of course, they were both having an amazing battle to the end in that sprint race. Of course, Liam did come out on top in that race, but who is going to come out on top in the feature race? Of course, Liam just literally riding on the bumper of Phelan there. Of course, Crazy drops down into 6th place. Don't know what happened there. Of course, Dion's still sitting pretty in 4th. Of course, he's got Rob and Crazy, also Hans, all looking to get past him though. As you see there, of course, Rob made that decision, of course, to start on the hards and end on the mediums. Of course, so far it is working. He is up and into 5th. Of course, that is where he started. Of course, Liam, of course, he did start last. He is made up 14 positions already in this race. Of course, Phelan starting 2nd. Of course, he's made up 1 position. As we go back up to the front 3, I think Mystic Rick is just feeling like the 3rd wheel here. Of course, he is in 3rd. Of course, just not managing to get past anyone so far because of the battle between the McLaren and the Kick Sauber. Of course, Dion and Rob just managing just to escape that 1 second from, of course, Hans and Crazy. Of course, now Rob will be looking to quickly make use of those medium tyres. Of course, Dion, he's been on his hard tyre for 7 laps. Of course, Rob will just be looking to make those medium tyres just work for him, and of course try and pull away. Of course, there's Coomboy getting a 3-second time penalty. That makes us only 3 people in this race does not have penalties. Of course, Liam's still in 1st place, of course, until we get to that DRS straight. Mystic Rick, of course, has to be getting angry, just having to sit there and wait. Of course, there's Crazy picking up another 3-second time penalty, so that's him up to 6 seconds of time penalties. And of course, Phelan, he is going to get past Liam now into the 1st corner. Of course, Liam done this last time. He's got the outside line, then he's got the inside line, and he managed to keep himself into 1st. Of course, just baiting Phelan into making that inside line. Of course, there's Dion with another 3-second time penalty. Of course, now we're down to only 2 people that have not got penalties. Of course, that was Dion's 1st. Of course, everyone behind him does have 6-second penalties. Because the only person that's actually in the points that doesn't have penalties, of course, is Rob. Of course, sitting 4th place on those mediums. course, we have got still the battle for first, of course. If Liam manages to pull away, that opens up a nice opportunity for Mystic Rick. But of course, Liam, what an unstoppable race that man has had. Of course, he started last. He's up into second place so far, of course, in the battle for first. Of course, this time Phelan does manage to get ahead of Liam. Oh! And there's contact there with the Sauber. I did see some debris come flying off of the Sauber there, of course. That does not help him in any way. No visual damage, but I think he has got a little bit of damage, of course. It looks like that underfloor, of course, he can't turn properly. Of course, as you've seen there, with a little bit of slide there, of course, not going to be happy. And there's Mystic Rick picking up another 3-second time penalty, of course. That does help Liam, of course. He is, of course, still there, not falling back too far, of course. He'll be wanting to get back past Mystic Rick. But if he does have any damage, of course, on the inside of his car, that's going to make it really hard for him to get back past. Of course, Phelan up there in first place. Of course, in now last place, of course, Fleming just in front of the front three. And there goes the Kick Sauber up and back into first place. Here's Rolly was just sitting there, of course. Imagine there was a safety car right now, of course. What would all the drivers do there? Of course, the front three just, of course, making their name for themselves, of course. 6.8 seconds ahead of fourth, of course. That is Rob, of course, with Dion and Hans behind him. As Kumba gets another 3-second time penalty, of course. Mystic Rick is now in second. Of course, Liam, you could tell that he was angry, of course. He knew that he had to get back up into first place one way or another, and he dive bombed it at the first corner, and it worked. Yo, we're about to go on to lap 25. Of course, definitely an interesting race to say the least. Of course, the front three have just managed to pull away. Of course, crazy they're getting another 3-second time penalty added on at the end of the race, of course. Of course, his Hans getting past Dion there. Of course, Frost Rob just trying to keep him up in there in fourth, of course, on that medium tyre. Of course, it will wear out faster than the people's behind him on the hards. Because there's Dion picking up another 3-second time penalty. Just have a look, of course. So we've got Hans with a 9-second time penalty there. Of course, Mystic Rick, of course, he is in first place right now, but he does have an extra penalty. Of course, his Hans getting up into fourth place. Of course, just managing to get past Rob there. course, Mystic Rick looking to get back past Phelan. Of course, he might be able to get one of those 3-second time penalties removed after the race. It just depends if they were his fault. Of course, Liam has had an absolute stellar of a race so far. Of course, just got 3 more laps to go. Yeah, of course, Rob just keeping it in 4th place. Of course, hopefully, if he shouldn't pick up any other time penalties, because there's Mystic Rick with 9 seconds of penalties. If it keeps like this, Rob is looking at a podium finish. Of course, this race is almost over. Of course, Liam, of course, he has pulled away from Phelan. Of course, Phelan does not have the DRS. I don't think he's too happy with that. Definitely my driver of the day for me is definitely so far is Liam. Of course, started last and now he's up into 1st. Of course, amazing racing here by the Kick Sauber. I mean, to do that, that is just something unbelievable, and you wouldn't really think of it, of course, until it actually happens. And of course, Liam has made that happen. Of course, next lap will be the final lap. Of course, Liam's just trying to keep Mystic Rick out of that DRS. Of course, failing, looking to get past him. Of course, if it stays like this, of course, Mystic Rick will get dropped down into 4th place. Of course, making Rob get that podium, of course, that he has been wanting. Of course, if Liam wins this race, he would have won the sprint race and the main race. Of course, we're on to the final lap, ladies and gentlemen. If this is the lap to overtake on, then you need to do it on this lap. Of course, this is the only chance that you've got to overtake. Just to say that Dion and Hans overtake Rob, as Hans gets another 3-second time penalty added on. And we've got a battle for 1st place on the last lap. Phelan managing to catch up to the back of Liam. Is Phelan going to spoil Liam's victory? Of course, if Liam wins, he will take the maximum points out this weekend. Of course, 1st place in both races. Of course, Mystic Rick with another 12-second time penalty. Is Phelan going to be able to get past the Kick Sauber of Liam? Oh, and Phelan goes off the track and he's had a little bit of a slide there. Of course, Mystic Rick will cross the line in second, but your winner of this race is Liam. Of course, he did win the sprint race and he wins today's race. Of course, Rob getting third place, of course, because everyone with the time penalties. And then you got Mystic Rick in fourth, Dion in fifth, Realm in sixth, Hans in seventh, Crazy in eighth, Coomboy in ninth, Sven is going to cross the line in 10th place, and then you've got Danger in 11th, Sin Wars in 11th, sorry, Danger in 12th, Mark in 13th, of course Fleming in 14th, but what a drive from Liam there, what an outstanding race. Of course, taking out the maximum points of the whole weekend, first to last. You would never see something like that. And he is my driver of the day as well. And he is the driver of the day in the game, of course. First to last, of course. Making up all those positions, of course. Doing that undercut that worked to his dream, of course. What a celebration that is, anyway. Of course, we'll give you the rundown of the grid. Of course, we need to see the race director. But while Liam coming home with that first place in the main race and in the sprint race, of course, first to last. That was amazing there. Sorry, last to first. Because definitely something that you would never usually see. Of course, but wow, Liam has made the impossible become possible. Of course, getting that first place, of course, taking out the maximum points, taking that 33 points home in his back pocket with him. Of course, right. And thanks everyone for watching, and I'll be back with you next week, and we'll see you next time.